very unstable part of the country. And so we worked with the 416 program to move commodity there for the first time in modern history, sell it, and then develop everything from dairies to wells to greenhouses to educational exchanges, working with U.S. State Department and AID and USDA. Not an easy marriage. But one of the aspects of that has been exchanges. And there are special women's exchange programs that have come as a result of that, where in fact every single person coming to our region now from Lebanon every year, 6 to 12 people, are all women for leadership development, just what you're talking about. That is the smallest part of the budget. The biggest part of the budget is money that's gone for village development, for research projects at universities based in Lebanon. And I'm sitting here and thinking, in all these villages that have been helped and all these projects, what happened with the women? I don't know the answer to the question. We're going to find out. Because that is, that's really, you've given me an important perspective just in what we've tried to do. And I would offer that our office has done as much or more than other offices in terms of world development on the agricultural front. And I'm really wondering, when it gets down on the ground, what actually happens.
Exactly.
See, structurally, I hear what you're saying. I can understand what you're saying, but structurally within these agencies and departments and the laws that have been written, I think we need to work with you and with your board to more specifically identify places in authorizing legislation and appropriations legislation where we can change language and offer amendments. In the same way as happened with microenterprise, for example.
I really think that really makes sense to me, because there's good intention, and then by the time you put it through the structure, which is itself consistent with the persistence of hunger, you put it through that structure, you have more hunger. And the people who are trying to put it through there want the end of hunger. But you put it through the existing structure. The existing structures are consistent with the persistence of hunger, most of them. And that's where the difficulty is. And as you say, that's where we need to be creative, and so that people who want to have the end of hunger, want sustainable development, can have their money make the difference that they want it to make, can have development assistance make the difference that it's wanted to make.
Let me mention, this is really a hot potato. Inside Israel, we visited several. In fact, Karen was on that trip. You can verify what I'm saying here. And this was in 1999, I think, wasn't it? When prospects for peace were very high. And we were talking about a combined package of agricultural assistance to Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and Lebanon. And Israel at first said, well, we don't really need any agricultural assistance because we're self-sufficient and so forth. And we said, but in going into some of these areas, particularly some of the mixed villages, we're not so sure that everybody has what they want and that there's enough. And I remember going out to one meeting. It was off the record with a very high-ranking woman in that government, who said to us in a private cocktail party, well, I go out to the villages and meet with women. And the purpose is to figure out culturally how they can increase income in their households, because they basically don't go outside the home. And while I've been there, I gave out a phone number because I talked about the issue of domestic violence. And so I gave my phone number, even though that wasn't the main reason for my visit. And she said, the one weekend I got back to my home, she had gotten hundreds of phone calls. I'll never forget that conversation. And I thought, wait a minute. We give all this money for everything under the sun. What's going on in that country in terms of food production and the treatment of women and family security? I left, but she only felt free to speak after hours.
Yes,
And yet we give billions of dollars a year.
yes.
And what are we doing? What are we doing? And again, in every picture that comes from that part of the world, if you find a woman in a photo, show it to me. Other than mourning. Other than mourning. So there's something here that is very difficult, but that I think through agriculture we can do something. I keep wondering, in that village in Lebanon that I was into, the women asked us for help in canning their cherries and peaches. And I really wonder whether any help was actually gotten to them in a way that was appropriate for what they could do.
Exactly.
Yes, sir.
I hadn't heard many of the points Joan was speaking of today until like 2 or 3 years ago. And when I started speaking out to men, they got it, because the chain of logic is so clear and so powerful. All you have to do is lay out this, boom, they get it.
Yeah.
So there's no problem talking to men about it. I urge everybody to talk to men and don't hold back about that kind of thing.
Yes.
I mean, guys get it. They just didn't know it.
Right, that's right. I think in the developing world, that's not as a clear shot through as it is here. But I would agree with your analysis clearly in the developed world. Sorry.
Yes.
I'm Peter Vaughan, the chairman of the board of the Hunger Project, and I'd like to just draw your attention to one of the many ironies that we now face with Iraq. Prior to the war, the Arab leader most committed to the rights of women was Saddam Hussein. He appointed women to high-level positions in the government. He stood against Islamic fundamentalism and their efforts to suppress women. He required that every girl go to school and was willing to cut off the electricity to the homes if the parents refused to send them. We now are in a position where the women of Iraq potentially are going to be far worse off under Bremer and the military administration than they were under Saddam Hussein. And I think the Congress has a real obligation to be on top of this and see that this doesn't happen.
There was a very potent op-ed piece in the New York Times today, written by someone from Iraq saying, "Woman, I can't go out of my home anymore. You know, we used to be able to go out, we, you know, are educated, we, you know," she said, you know, last October when Saddam, in preparation for the war, let all the prisoners and the rapists, etc. out, it's unsafe. And then she articulated the number of women friends that she knows that were raped or harmed recently. So they just stay in their rooms, in their houses, and she said often to darken the houses so people don't come even to the houses.
Yes,
I was just wondering, it seems there's so many organizations that work to empower women.
Could you stand up?
Sure. It seems there's so many organizations that help to empower women, like, you know, UNFP. I mean, there's thousands, but so many of them don't get the funding that they need. So how can the international community work to empower women when these organizations aren't getting the resources and the means for which to do so?
It's part of the problem, isn't it? I mean, I read today that our hockey team, our women's hockey team, can't be funded in the United States of America. You know, so I mean, it's a real issue for all of us to get funding. And I was so pleased when Mrs. McCarthy talked about funding the Hunger Project, you know, because it's individuals, we get only very little money from corporations and foundations. But I think as you let both men and women know what's happening in the world, they will fund it. I don't know in the international setting, in the UN, I just don't think there's enough women's leadership in those top agencies which are funded to make the difference that we need to have made, frankly.
This is why I think the convergence of members of Congress who happen to be female and their male supporters and the women ambassadors are a very important link. We probably have never had this conversation with the women ambassadors, but you know, they may be totally conscious of this, but many of them come from countries, where maybe agriculture isn't something that's necessarily on their minds. And so just developing that consciousness would be important.
And often they're not as conscious as we would like them to be. I mean, they understand their world, their life, but often, and I think women, we do this anyhow, see that as idiosyncratic. We don't see that as a whole society-wide issue. So even women in the developing world who you think would know this issue cold really do not. I mean, when we go to India and Bangladesh, when I first went to India and Bangladesh and talked about the Asian Enigma study of UNICEF in 1996, that was news to everyone, news. And I will never forget one man came up and I was talking about the subjugation of women in India. He did not deny what I was saying and the statistics and the evidence, but he said, just please don't use the word subjugation. So he didn't come up and say, how can we correct it? Just don't, just don't say the word, So it's very, very difficult and a very dicey conversation in the developing world also. Very, very dicey. When we started our whole programs to empower women as the key change agents, it took 2 or 3 years before we could educate our own people in the developing world to understand this issue so significantly and so deeply that they could stand for it and have programs consistent with it. People sometimes are ashamed of what's happening and want to hide it rather than cure it or solve it. And I can understand that. On the other hand, we need to be brave in these times and courageous and go for it.
My question, I'm Susanna with the Professional Leader Center. My question goes back to your work with the elected women in India. How do you think they will be able to have an impact on this practice of debt slavery, where women and girls are sold into slavery, working at these brick factories or different places to pay off a debt that maybe even was incurred 3 generations back? Do you think they'll have an impact on eradicating this practice?
Initially, in the first 6 months of the first year, I don't think they will. I think initially in the first 6 months or the first year, they'll learn to speak up. They'll learn what power they have. They'll learn that if they, in our leadership training, they actually have a day when they say how would they like their village to be and what the priorities are. And they're really talking about sanitation, getting the children to school, better nutrition. That's what they'll focus on. And I think that'll happen for the 2 to 3 years. They do focus on dowry. They do focus on child labor. They do focus on those issues. But those other issues, I think the women are going to need to be in power a little longer. And as they are, I think they will change the development agenda to meet basic needs. And they'll, tackle dowry and some of the other issues. But I think they need to be in office a little bit longer before those other issues are taken up. But there is the prospect that they will take it up. Without them in the local government, there's no hope. We really see a very positive results from the women in local government. Some of the women said, I stood for election only because my husband told me to, and I thought, and he said he would really control my votes and tell me how to vote, even though it was reserved for women. But when they go through the leadership training, it's a new day. No one's going to tell them how to vote. They have their own name, they have their own place, they know the Constitution, they know they have rights. And we hook them up with a whole network of other self-help groups for women, so they're not alone. They are a part of a huge kind of movement in that country, and they know it. So, but we really need to recognize we're starting with women who before were not allowed to go out of their house without seeking permission from a male member of the house, even if that male member were a son 7 years old. But it's the only way through. It's the only way through. And when I'm inspired by it, but when you see what the women can do, you just know that there's a new future there. I mean, it's absolutely the pathway. There's no question about it.
Let me just say that with the Hunger Center here and with the Women's Caucus staff members here, I would hope that working with the Hunger Project, that you might come back to the members with some recommendations, legislative recommendations. I mean, you're authorized to do that sort of activity, and that would give it a focus inside the Congress. You don't go home and think, well, I went there and emptied my suitcase, but what am I carrying back with me?
Right.
And Roger Shimrai, our chief of staff, is here, and we'll be happy to work with you to pull ideas together and make them available. You know, we'll get the members' input so that we come up with some kind of a little working agenda. I'd suggest, you know, steps. Can't all be done at once,
Yes.
but ways so that members would know how to proceed in their various jurisdictions. There was another, yes.
Yes, I'm a volunteer with the Hunger Project for a long time, and something I haven't heard mentioned today that I thought was important. Joan has said we are doing this in various countries as she's been speaking about the programs. What I want to make sure people realize is that the way the Hunger Project works is to empower people in leadership in those countries. We're not bringing Americans to India. When Joan says, we empower the women, we lead a workshop, it's not Americans or Germans or British leading the workshop. It's Indian leaders leading the workshop. So I think that's a real key piece.
I really appreciate that. It is key in all of our programs. We have programs in 7 countries in Africa, India, Bangladesh, 3 countries in Latin America. In all of our programs, if you go to Ghana, the program is led by someone from Ghana, and all the workshops are led by people in Ghana. One of the workshops that we've recently put together is a workshop on HIV, AIDS, and gender. And it's the only workshop thus far in Africa at the grassroots level that deals with the fundamental issue of that disease in Africa, which is gender inequality. There's no question about it. And we have found, we will, all the workshops are led by the grassroots leaders in Africa. So the grassroots leaders in Africa will have led the workshop, and over 100,000 people will take it this year. And when we created the workshop, I went to Uganda, and we had representatives from Africa, from 8 countries, and we co-created the workshop together. And when people said, you're going to have a workshop when you really say what the problem is, that men have multiple partners and unsafe sex, and women have no voice in protecting themselves and no information, you're going to say that? You're going to go to Africa and say that? Well, either we're naive or courageous, but we did go to Africa. We found no problem working with the people. They said that's exactly the issue, but no one addresses it. And, you know, the men met together and the women met together in that workshop. And the men came back and said, we are responsible for this HIV being out of control. We make a commitment to change that. I mean, they're straight on. It was just phenomenal. It's like you said about the men. Once they understand the issue, they take it up completely. And people on the grassroots level are saying, yes, this is the problem. They're not shy about it. They discuss it openly, and it's making a difference. And it's, to date, I feel 2 ways about this. I'm proud for the Hunger Project that we're the organization that are offering this HIV gender inequality workshop. I'm proud of that, and I'm dismayed that we're the only organization on the African continent that is addressing this issue at the grassroots level with this degree of honesty and candor. So I have both feelings. But I do appreciate what she said, because the Hunger Project is led by the people of that country, whatever country it is. And that's part of empowering leadership. The woman who leads our program in India is Rita Surin, and she's been committed to this issue and women's empowerment for so long. And when she discovered the Hunger Project, even though we pay a lot less than the other organizations with whom she could work, she couldn't resist.
But I think that Joan has put in a yo woman's effort here for the last hour and a half, and I don't want to deny anyone the opportunity to make a comment or ask a question, but why don't we formally end the session right now? If there are those who have other matters they wish to take up or wish to engage here in conversation, why don't we do that? I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank Joan and your staff and all those who've traveled such a distance to be with us. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank Marcy Kaptur. Isn't it wonderful to have a partner in Washington? I also want to thank and so much. I've heard of you for so long. The representative from Kansas, Mrs. Murphy. And she's a friend to the Hunger Project. She invests in the Hunger Project, so I'd like to thank her. Is it a wonderful partnership?
Yes. All we need is someone for you staff to work with.